In this video today, I'm going to share with you guys how to set up SIMPLIFY3D, Cura, as well as Superslicer for the Adventure 4. So we're here on SIMPLIFY3D, and I'm just going to walk you through the steps through this slicer first, and then we'll go through Superslicer and then Cura. So for SIMPLIFY3D, what you want to do is when you first initially log in, you're going to be asked to configure your printer. However, you can go to the Help menu in the top menu bar, which is not shown on my screen here because I'm on a Mac. But you can go to the Help section and click Configuration Assistant. When the Configuration Assistant opens, you get a screen looking like this, and you're told to select your printer. If you go down this list, you'll notice that in the Flash Forge section, you don't actually see the Adventure 3 or 4. You see the Adventure 3, but the 4 is not here right now. I have been given the FFF files for the Adventure 4 by contacting SIMPLIFY3D support. So I'm actually going to leave a link to that, hopefully a Dropbox link, so that you guys can download that. So when you guys actually download the Adventure 4 FFF file from my Dropbox, you can actually import it, and we'll just do that right now for you guys. So importing the FFF file for the Adventure 4. We can see here, these are the base parameters. You can actually play around with these, so the only things that are really important are in the G-code section as well as the script section. Everything else can be kind of configured to what your liking is depending on your printer setup. So first, going over the G-code section, you want to make sure that 5D firmware is enabled. Use independent extruder axes. Firmware supports sticky parameters. You have a Cartesian robot. Your x-axis is 220, y-axis is 200, and z is 250. And this is the build volume of your printer, which is advertised. The origin offset, we want to set it to the center of the build plate, which is why the origin offset is half of the build volumes, minus the z-axis, which you actually want to be 0. The homing direction should be set to min, min, and min, because that's how the homing works on the Adventure 4. Also, you want to make sure that the flip build table axis is checked for the y-axis. And your tool offset, just leave that at 0, 0. And the type of firmware is the FlashForge Dreamer firmware. And the baud rate is 115,200 bits per second. Now going over to the script section. So these are the initial scripts. I'm not sure why my SIMPLIFY3D does this. Maybe this is just a bug in the program. But for the starting scripts, you want M140, which sets the bed temperature, and it's going to take the variable bed temperature or bed 0 temperature. Also, you want to set the first extruder or your only extruder's temperature, and make sure that you set the T1. If you had a second extruder, just set that to 0. I think this is just standard practice. You also want to use absolute coordinates, home all axes, and you can read all the different comments over here. You also want to make sure that these additional terminal commands are present. And these are basically commands for the printer to do during post-processing of your G-code. If you go over to these other tabs, the only thing that has other content in there is the ending script. And these are the things that you want to see in your end script. Other than that, I can just kind of walk through each of these tabs so you guys can pause the video. And if you're interested in checking these settings out, you can pause the video. Another thing to note is that these settings are for PLA, because that's the material that's selected here. They don't have PETG, so I've made my own PETG profile for the Adventure 4, which I will be sharing in a future video once I've got stringing down. Okay, so that was SIMPLIFY3D, and now let's move on to Superslicer. So for Superslicer here, we can go to the Configuration Assistant. Again, this is in the top menu, and you go to Configuration, Configuration Assistant. Then you get this large screen that pops up. So our printer is none of these printers over here, so we can actually go all the way down to Custom Printer. And there aren't many settings that you can do in Superslicer to configure your printer, so it's fairly easy to set up. For firmware, I've selected Marlin here. If anyone else has tried any other flavor firmware, let me know, but so far Marlin's worked for me. The bed shape, you want to make sure that it's 220 in the X direction and 200 in the Y direction, and your origin should be in the center, so again, half of the X and half of the Y. Your print diameters, your nozzle is 0.4 millimeters unless you have a different nozzle. And of course, your filament diameter is just a standard 1.75. And lastly, for temperatures, you don't have to worry about these because you're changing these based on the filament you're using. Updates, you can skip this, reload from disk, skip that. View mode, you can choose simple mode, advanced mode, or expert mode. I chose expert because this gives me all the settings that I can play with. I'd rather see them all than have some settings cut out. After you're done that, you can just click on the finish button. But for me, I've already got my printer set up, so I'm not going to click on the finish button here. I'll also scroll through the printer settings because you're going to need to add a few things here. So the max print height, you have to set this to 250. This might not be set correctly when you initially start it, because that's just the build volume of the Adventure 4. Set this to a single extruder. Again, here you can see the flavor firmware. I just changed it. It should be Marlin. One other thing that you must do, or at least what I found really helps, is set this maximum G1s per second. So this is the maximum number of move commands where you're printing stuff per second. And the reason why I set this to 3000 is because if it goes any higher, you actually run the risk of stuttering. And I did a video on the stuttering effect just a couple weeks ago or so. So if you want, check that video out and you can see what the stuttering effect is all about. For custom G code, this is all the custom G code that I have. This is the start code, this is the end code. Feel free to pause the video here and copy those. For the machine limits, you want to change these to 150 millimeters per second because that's the max travel that the printer is capable of. Your maximum feed rate in the Z direction, this should be 16 millimeters per second. Your maximum feed rate, 80 millimeters per second. I set this to 80 in case this also encompasses retractions. I haven't run into any issues with this so far, so that's what I have set it to. For the extruder, nozzle diameter is 0.4 over here. And these are all the other settings that I have. My retractions, these are not necessary for you to set to, but this can be kind of a guide for you. And note that these are set up for PETG currently. Just like SIMPLIFY3D, right now these are settings for PETG, so you don't actually have to copy these. You should actually go and explore yourself what these settings are for your printer. Now, jumping over to Cura. So here, when you're setting up a new printer, you can go to Settings, Printer, and Manage Printers. Here we can actually add a new printer. So when you add a new printer, you're going to add a non-network printer. And you can see none of these options will match. So if I scroll down and we try to find FlashForge, there's only the Dreamer NX here. So we're going to have to do another custom printer. You want to do a custom FFF printer. And you want to add that. Right here, this is the next screen you're going to see, but I'm going to jump over to my actual settings because these aren't the ones. So I'm just going to cancel out of this and I'll show you what I have set up for my printer. So these are my custom FFF printer settings. We've got X width as 220, Y as 200, the Z as 250. Again, this is the build volume. Build plate shape, rectangular. We want the origin at the center. We have a heated bed, but not a heated build volume. And again, G-code flavor is Marlin. This is the start code, and this is the end code that I have for Cura. And so far, it's worked well for me. I've also got print head settings here. I don't know how much they actually influence a print because they haven't really done anything as far as I've seen. So you can feel free and copy these and know that if you're using an Adventure 4, it shouldn't break your printer. As for the extruder, it's pretty standard here, 0.4, 1.75. And that's it. That's how you set up Cura. Just like with every other slicer, you're going to have to tune your Cura profile for each material that you're using. So that pretty much wraps it up for my video on these three slicers that I've been using on my Adventure 4 in addition to Flashprint. Right now I've pretty much stopped using Flashprint. However, there's one feature that's interesting or quite nice in Flashprint. And I'll pull that up right over here. So the one thing that I really appreciate about Flashprint is this setting over here, start point acceleration. So this makes sure that the printer actually accelerates as it starts a new path instead of trying to send it at full speed right away. So this start point acceleration just gives you a distance for the printer to accelerate over. And this ends up usually giving you a slightly smoother print. However, there's things like wipe and coasting that aren't available, which are kind of a deal breaker for me in Flashprint. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video on the three slicers that aren't fully supported by FlashForge. I've truly enjoyed using these slicers, and each slicer has their own pros and cons. If we could only push them all together and have all those beautiful settings, then we would have a Superslicer. I mean, maybe we'll call it a Hyperslicer because we have Superslicer already. Anyways, I've got a couple of videos up on the screen. If you guys are interested in those, you can check them out. And if not, that's a wrap.